Let's break down our must-start defenses heading into Week 14 of the fantasy season and talk about what defenses are going to help you dominate the week, as well as what defenses we can pick up off of the waiver wire to help you dominate Week 14. And with 6 teams on bye week and the most crucial week of the fantasy season yet, you are not going to want to skip this video. All right, so like I mentioned, 6 teams on bye week here in Week 14 and some important teams. The Baltimore Ravens, well, we haven't really been trusting them, so they're not a big option here. The Broncos, one of our must-starts almost on a weekly basis, off this week. The Texans, disappointing this past week to say the least, but they have still been very good over the past couple weeks. Then we got the Colts, Patriots, and Commanders on bye week this week as well. So it could be a tough week. Let's break down what we got for this week's schedule. Like I said, it's a tough week for streaming defenses, not just because we have 6 teams on bye week, but overall, it's just a tough week. We're starting off the week with the Packers at the Lions. So the Lions have been playable. The Packers have been playable, but on a short week in this matchup, I'm staying away from both defenses here. Then we look a little bit forward. The Dolphins have an interesting opportunity against the Jets, but I just don't trust this Dolphins defense from a fantasy perspective. I just truly don't. So I don't think that they are going to be an option. Then we continue to look here. I was thinking about the Eagles, but I've also said over the past couple of weeks, this Panthers team right now, they're not just a team that we can stream every defense against, and they have proven that over the past couple weeks. So I do think the Eagles could provide a nice floor at home against Bryce Young and company, but I don't quite think I'm ready to fully trust them as a must-start defense here in Week 14. We got the Bills traveling to face the Rams. We could see a solid floor potentially out of the Bills, but Rams offense, do I really want to count against them right now? I don't think so. Then we do have the Chargers and Chiefs, and I do think either of these defenses could potentially show up. I personally don't trust the Chiefs. I've talked about this all season long. For the most part, I talked about it last week even against the Raiders, and they are just not a good fantasy defense. The Chargers coming off of a double-digit performance, but on the road, primetime football against the Chiefs, I don't quite know that I can trust the Chargers. Then we end the week with the Bengals and the Cowboys, and for some reason, I feel like one of those two teams could perform well, but I don't trust either of them. And I know the Cowboys have been very good. We talked about them last week and the week before, but I'm not starting them against the Bengals. So it's a tough week overall with those 6 teams on bye week and some interesting matchups here. But I think I got 6 teams for you guys that I'm going to call must-start defenses going into Week 14. So let's kick the video off with the New Orleans Saints, who are going to be traveling to face the New York Giants. And the Saints have not been very good. I mean, just straight up. They're not good against the run. They haven't been great against the pass. But they got an opportunity this week against Drew Lock and company. But first, let's look at what the Saints did this past week. It wasn't very good. They allowed 21 points. They had 2 sacks, no turnovers, a total of 322 total yards allowed, just 2 fantasy points. So they haven't hit double digits since Week 6 against the Bucs. On the season, 25 sacks, 11 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, and 12 interceptions. So, like I said, they haven't been very good. They sit at just 15% rostered. They only had 2 fantasy points this past week, but they're definitely going to be in the streaming category this week, as Drew Lock did run for a touchdown last week, but he also had a lost fumble and an interception, and overall the Giants offense really struggled against the Cowboys, who, like I mentioned earlier, had double digits this past week against the Giants. So I think the Saints here on the road have a nice opportunity. They got to be in that streaming category. There's only so many teams right now that we can look at and say, yeah, let's stream against that unit right now. And the Giants are up there, whether it's Tommy DeVito or Drew Lock in the last 2 weeks. Both defenses that have faced the Giants in fantasy have had double digits and 12-plus fantasy points. So I will risk the Saints this week, especially if I have a defense on bye week like the Broncos or the Texans. The Saints are going to be up there as one of the top streaming options going into Week 14. All right, and we got a risky one early in the video this week, and that is the Tennessee Titans coming off of a performance in Week 13 where they had 1 fantasy point against the Washington Commanders. They allowed 42 total points. They had 2 sacks. They did have a forced fumble. They did have an interception, so it's a little bit encouraging. They did allow 463 total yards. They are the defense 27 in fantasy. They have not been good this year. We all know that, right? They've had 24 sacks, 6 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, and 5 interceptions. They have found a way to have 2 double-digit fantasy performances since week 9, with 11 fantasy points in week 9 against the Patriots, then 10 fantasy points against the Texans in week 12. So I think that they're very intriguing this week, as they are going to go up against the Jacksonville Jaguars, who we do know are going to have Mac Jones as a starting quarterback. Now, I guess there's a chance that Trevor Lawrence, who's dealing with the concussion, could technically play this week, but I'm going to bank on him not playing this week on the road against Tennessee. So Mac Jones on the road against Tennessee. I mean, come on. I know Mac Jones did some things this past week, right? We saw Parker Washington, Brian Thomas Jr. score. Don't get me wrong. You never know what's going to happen here. But the Titans have actually ranked pretty highly against opposing wide receivers and quarterbacks throughout the season, and they're okay against the run. So listen, this one's risky. Don't get me wrong. And Mac Jones was much better in relief of Trevor Lawrence in week 13 than what we saw in weeks 10 and 11, where he had 4 turnovers, 3 interceptions, 1 lost fumble in those 2 weeks. But if I'm going to risk a play this week, it's going to be the Titans sitting at 7% rostered at home against Mac Jones. We'll see how this one plays out. They're definitely in the streaming category due to this matchup. And then next up, we have a team that we talked about in last week's video that I really wish I talked about more, and that is the Seattle Seahawks, who are going to travel to face the Arizona Cardinals. This team is just really starting to show that they are a good defensive unit, and maybe part of their identity is being a defensive team first, right? 16 fantasy points against the Jets this past week. They allowed 21 total points, but they had 2 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, a fumble recovery, an interception, and a scoring touchdown. They now have a defensive touchdown in 2 straight games. We look on the season, 28 total sacks, 9 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, 8 interceptions, and 3 scoring touchdowns. Actually, make that 4 scoring touchdowns, because I believe that number might not be updated. But anyways, we look at what they've done in the past 2 weeks. 20 points against Arizona in week 12, 16 against the Jets this past week. So it's going to be really tough with them sitting at 26% rostered and knowing that they had 20 fantasy points against Kyler Murray and company 2 weeks ago to not consider them a strong streaming option. And we look at Kyler Murray over the last 3 weeks, right? You can even take it to the last 4 weeks, okay? This past week against Minnesota, 2 interceptions and a fumble that was not lost. The week before against Seattle, an interception. Their last game before that was in week 10. He had a fumble, not lost. Then in week 9 against Cincinnati, a lost fumble in that game. And even the week before, a fumble in that game as well. So Kyler Murray has kind of had some turnover issues as of late, and he's not playing at as high of a ceiling for the most part over the past couple weeks, right? It's been kind of an up and down experience for that Cardinals offense as of late. Now, they are at home this week. That could benefit them. Don't get me wrong, but we've seen some turnovers out of Kyler as of late, and that's going to potentially benefit the Seattle Seahawks this week, who have double digits in 2 straight games. And one of those last 2 games was against the Cardinals. So I think they're really up there in terms of a strong streaming option that will have a good floor, but have tons of upside here in week 14. Let's take a timeout to let me remind you that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their week 14 NFL pick'ems are already going live, and all their Monday Night Football pick'ems for week 13 are live as well. Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH, that link is down below, a free NFL pick'em to use either towards Monday Night Football or Week 14's action. On top of that, Underdog is also giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL pick'em to use towards this week's action, and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. And next up, we got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And I do want to mention, I think they are very risky, but they do have a decent matchup this week against the Las Vegas Raiders. They really disappointed in week 13 for those of you who decided to stream them with just 4 fantasy points. They moved up to 69% rostered, mainly because they played Tommy DeVito and the Giants in week 12. Then you're getting Bryce Young this week. Now you're getting the Raiders this week. It's a really strong stretch, but I'm starting to really worry about this defensive unit, I will say. But if there's one last week that I'm going to try them out in, it's probably here during the Biocalypse against Aiden O'Connell and company. Now, that is that does not go without saying that Aiden O'Connell was not that bad this past week against the Kansas City Chiefs. We got to give him some flowers, right? I even talked about him in the waiver video, okay? He had 340 passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns against the Chiefs. So I thought maybe this would be worse than Gardner Minshew, but I guess that debate's still out there, right? So, early in the season, we saw some really bad performances out of Aiden O'Connell against teams like Denver and Pittsburgh, and we saw those turnovers, right? And on the season, the Raiders have been one of the best teams to stream defensive units against, but I don't know. Brock Bowers, Jacoby Myers, whatever running back they sign off of the street this week, whoever it's going to be, Aiden O'Connell, a quarterback, like they might actually be able to come through. So I do think that the Buccaneers hold the most risk potentially out of any team in this video, like even over the Titans potentially. But there's still a option that you can consider, as the Raiders, like I said, have been one of the best teams to stream defensive units against. But if we see what we saw the Raiders this past week, you're definitely going to be disappointed in the Buccaneers once again in week 14. But they do have some nice upside as we approach the week as well. Then we're not making a must-start video without talking about the Minnesota Vikings, who I know it's been rough the past 2 weeks. If you are a Vikings owner and you've continued to stick with them, 6 fantasy points this past week. They allowed 22 total points. They had a sack, they had a forced fumble, and they had 2 interceptions with 406 total yards allowed against the Arizona Cardinals the week before. Just 7 fantasy points. But, if you're kind of desperate here in the Biocalypse, they provide a good floor on a week-to-week basis, and they still can get you close to that double-digit mark on most weeks. And here in week 14, while I do kind of worry about the Vikings the rest of the season being anything more than a floor play, I'll give it one last shot here as Kirk Cousins threw 4 interceptions this past week and had a fumble that was not lost. He's going to remain the starting quarterback. And then we got the element like, is this going to be a Kirk Cousins revenge game? Is he going to throw 4 touchdowns instead of 4 picks this past week? We'll find out. But then we take it a little bit further. Kirk Cousins has 0 passing touchdowns and 6 interceptions in his last 3 starts. And on top of that, he also has 4 fumbles. None of them lost fumbles, but 4 fumbles nonetheless. And then we take it back to week 7. Kirk Cousins has had a fumble in every single game since week 7, although just 2 of them lost fumbles. So I'm going to go ahead and say that I think we can still start the Vikings defense this week. And although they did give up, some offensive plays there to the Cardinals and everything, you watch that game, the defense is still just a very, very good defense at the end of the day. And maybe we get a revenge element out of Cousins this week. If this is going to be the game where he gets it back together, then maybe that's what happens here. But I'm going to bank on the Vikings defense continuing to be a good floor option and a strong overall defense here in week 14. To wrap the video up with the Pittsburgh Steelers, no, you can't pick them up off of waivers, but they've been very dominant the past couple of weeks from a fantasy perspective. 10 or more fantasy points in every game since week 8, except for week 10 on the road against Washington. And even though they allowed 375 total yards this past week and 32 total points, they still had 17 fantasy points, 4 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, 2 fumble recoveries, an interception, and a defensive touchdown. I know I'm recording this before Monday Night Football, so I don't know how the Browns and Jameis Winston look against the Broncos, but we know, as much as I like Jameis Winston, even if he has a strong game against the Broncos, we know there's turnover potential with Jameis Winston as the starting quarterback. This is a home game for the Steelers. They lost to the Browns on the road in week 12. I think they come back in dominant fashion in week 14. So for some reason you're worried about the Steelers this week, if you own the Steelers, don't be worried. I mean, they still had double digits in week 12 against the Browns. So if you own the Steelers, keep rolling with them. They are a must-start defense in week 14. That'll do it for today's video. There are your must-start defenses and streams moving into week 14 of the fantasy season. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions in the comment section down below as I can. So if you guys need anything whatsoever, moving into week 14, be sure to drop me a comment. I'll get back to as many of you guys as I possibly can as soon as I can. But most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel because we're going to have each and everything you could possibly need throughout this week to help you dominate week 14 of the fantasy season. So be sure you are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.